When a mother becomes the manipulator, the gaslighting words that break a child's spirit. Today, we are stepping into a difficult truth, one many people carry silently for decades. The emotional reality of growing up under a narcissistic mother. The atmosphere around these relationships is not subtle. It is intense, confusing, and often deeply damaging. As someone who walked through this dynamic myself, scapegoated, dismissed, and rewritten by a narcissistic stepmother, I share these phrases not as theory, but as lived experience supported by psychological research and years of healing work. What you're about to read isn't just a list of statements. It's a map of manipulation, a demonstration of how gaslighting becomes a weapon and identity theft becomes part of the family system. Psychologists who study narcissistic family dynamics consistently find that gaslighting serves a singular purpose: control through confusion. When a child cannot rely on their own memory, perceptions, or emotional responses, they become easier to shape and easier to silence. Narcissistic mothers often repeat certain phrases not because they're careless, but because repetition builds psychological conditioning. Over time, the child stops arguing, not because the narcissist is right, but because exhaustion replaces self-trust. The first phrase, "That never happened. You're imagining things." Though simple, this sentence is devastating in psychological impact. Clinical psychologists describe this tactic as memory sabotage, erasing the child's lived experience so thoroughly that truth feels unstable. In the narcissist's mind, the translation is, if I can rewrite the past, I control the present and the narrative, and therefore you. For the victim, the outcome is often cognitive dissonance, self-doubt, and eventually learned helplessness. Healing begins when survivors learn to validate their memories, sometimes through journaling, therapy, or trauma-informed groups where their experiences are finally reflected instead of erased. Then comes the mocking dismissal. "Oh, you're too sensitive. It was just a joke." Psychologists call this emotional invalidation with social reinforcement. The narcissist reframes cruelty as humor, positioning themselves as harmless and the victim as dramatic, irrational, or fragile. When this tactic is used in front of others, as it often is, the child becomes both the target and the spectacle. The narcissist feeds on the emotional reaction and the social power it gives them. Victims internalize shame, often learning to disconnect from their emotions entirely. A powerful recovery strategy is reclaiming emotional legitimacy, learning that sensitivity is not weakness but information. The third manipulation, "I never said that. Don't put words in my mouth." Here, we see what psychologists label as reality erasure. Rather than engage in accountability, the narcissist rewrites the interaction entirely. They would rather rewrite history, deny their own words, or create confusion than admit fault. The psychological subtext is chilling. Your memory cannot be trusted. Mine is the only version that matters. For survivors, healing often involves learning what therapists call reality anchoring, affirming the truth without needing the narcissist's agreement. Another familiar attack. "You twist everything just to make me look bad." This is projection in its purest form. Instead of acknowledging harm, the narcissist reverses the accusation, preemptively casting the victim as the aggressor. Psychologists describe this as preemptive defense, a tactic meant to disarm confrontation and prevent accountability. The child learns a silent lesson. Honesty equals punishment. Survivors often need time to relearn that telling the truth is not a betrayal, but a boundary. The fifth phrase slices deeper into identity. "Everybody knows you exaggerate." This isn't just criticism, it's isolation. Narcissistic parents rely on what psychologists call reputational sabotage to strip the child of external validation. If no one believes them, then no one will challenge the narcissist's constructed reality. The translation, "Your credibility is the enemy of my power." For many survivors, the healing stage involves building a support network with people who validate rather than dismiss their experience. And then comes the final blow, the one that often makes survivors question their entire childhood. "You had a great childhood. You were not easy to raise." This dual-meaning sentence contains both self-praise and blame. In the narcissist's mind, they are rewriting the entire emotional narrative. "I was the perfect parent, and you were the problem." Psychologists call this identity reversal, where the abuser paints themselves as martyr and the child as the burden. This is the moment many survivors begin to disconnect from their memories, thinking, maybe I am wrong, maybe I was difficult, maybe it wasn't that bad. But the body remembers what the mind was forced to forget. So if you read these phrases and felt something tighten in your chest, or you suddenly remembered rooms in your childhood home you emotionally avoided, know this: you are not overreacting. You are remembering. And memory, when reclaimed, is the first step toward freedom. If you feel ready, the work ahead is not to convince the narcissist. It is to rebuild yourself. Through therapy, boundaries, community, and truth, survivors learn something the narcissist never intended. Your story was never theirs to rewrite. The psychological translation of the phrase you just read, "You had a great childhood, you were the problem," is essentially, how dare you complain? How dare you challenge the narrative? Your suffering is invalid because I have already rewritten your story. And this is not accidental. Psychologists who specialize in family trauma note that this tactic is one of the most damaging elements of narcissistic parenting because it fractures a child's ability to trust themselves. When the person responsible for nurturing reality instead weaponizes it, the child learns early that truth is not something stable, it is something imposed. This rewriting of childhood is not simply denial. It is what researchers refer to as narrative dominance, a psychological structure where the narcissistic parent becomes the only authorized historian of the family. Many survivors describe remembering events vividly, emotionally, somatically, yet being told repeatedly that those memories are false or exaggerated. Over time, that disconnect becomes internalized as I must be wrong. My perception is flawed. My emotions are dangerous. In therapy, survivors often describe the confusion as losing pieces of themselves. Because psychologically, that's exactly what happened. Those memories were stolen, minimized, or mocked until the child abandoned them for emotional safety. For the narcissistic mother, this narrative serves two psychological needs: preserving identity and avoiding accountability. As developmental psychologists explain, narcissists build their entire self-concept on an image rather than an inner truth. To admit fault, even privately, is to threaten that image. So instead, the child becomes the scapegoat, the emotional container, the mirror that reflects all the qualities the narcissistic parent cannot bear to see in themselves. What the child experienced as discipline or criticism was often displacement. The parent unloading unresolved shame, insecurity, fear, or emotional emptiness onto the child. And so the deeper message behind these phrases lodges itself not in memory, but in identity. You are the one who is flawed. You are the one who misunderstands. You are the one who needs fixing. Psychologists warn that this dynamic is often the birthplace of lifelong patterns. Codependency, people-pleasing, hypervigilance, perfectionism, emotional shutdown, difficulty trusting others, and perhaps most heartbreaking, difficulty trusting oneself. But here is where the narrative shifts, not with the narcissistic parent, but with you. Healing begins when the survivor recognizes that these patterns are not reflections of their defects, but evidence of their conditioning. Trauma-informed psychologists often remind survivors, you adapted to survive. Your responses were not character flaws, they were strategies. The moment survivors begin connecting their experiences with larger patterns, shared by countless others who were raised by narcissistic caregivers, the shame begins to loosen. There is a strange, powerful relief in realizing it wasn't personal. It was patterned. It was predictable. It was them, not you. And sometimes healing requires humor, not to minimize the pain, but to reclaim agency. The bingo card mentioned earlier may seem lighthearted, but psychologically, it serves a purpose: breaking the trance. When behavior becomes predictable, it becomes recognizable. When recognizable, it loses power. Survivors stop internalizing and start observing. That shift from "what's wrong with me?" to "oh, there it is again," is the moment emotional liberation begins. If you saw yourself in these phrases not once but repeatedly, it is highly likely that you were not raised in emotional safety, but in emotional distortion. Whether the narcissistic figure was a mother, stepmother, father, grandparent, or guardian, the psychological wounds remain similar, but so does the possibility of healing. You do not owe loyalty to a narrative that erased you. You do not have to carry beliefs that never belonged to you. You are allowed to step out of their story and finally step into your own. And slowly, steadily, painfully, and beautifully, you begin to reclaim the one thing they tried hardest to take: your reality.